So the Amazon rainforest is burning. It's been burning for months. This has become a story that's really dominated the news cycle, so it's important to understand why this is such a big deal. The most basic answer, of course, is that the Amazon produces a fifth of the world's oxygen and absorbs a fifth of the world's carbon dioxide. And so when we see something like this happening, we know that it's an environmental disaster, not just in itself, but because of the knock-on effects it could have for our climate. But if you look more closely at what's actually going on, there are a lot of nuances. First of all, yes, parts of the Amazon rainforest are on fire, but the majority of the rainforest is not. But even with the small portion that is, the numbers can be quite scary. For example, there were over 72,000 fires recorded in the Brazilian Amazon in the first 8 months of 2023 alone. That's 5 times higher than the previous record from 2020. So obviously, these fires are having some kind of impact on the amount of carbon being stored in the forest. In July of this year, for example, scientists estimated that the Amazon had gone from being a carbon sink, i.e., sucking in carbon dioxide, to being a carbon source, meaning that it was emitting more carbon dioxide than it was taking in. But then by August, it had flipped back again and started behaving like a normal rainforest, sucking in more CO2 than it was releasing. This still does mean that the rainforest isn't having a bigger impact on the climate than it used to be, though. You see, while forests do release carbon when they burn, they also release it in other ways, which is less obvious but potentially worse. Basically, while trees are alive, they store carbon in their tissues, and as long as that carbon stays inside the tree, it's relatively safe from ever getting into the atmosphere and contributing to the greenhouse effect. But once a tree dies, whether from fire or disease or any other cause, that carbon is released back into the atmosphere either immediately or slowly over time. And this is what scientists mean when they talk about forests becoming a carbon source. But forests also leak carbon dioxide in other ways. Even healthy, living trees naturally respire, i.e., breathe carbon dioxide out as part of their normal metabolic processes. So forests naturally release carbon even when they're not burning. And recent research suggests that as temperatures increase due to the climate crisis, trees are beginning to respire more and more, meaning that the forests of the world are leaking more carbon, even as they continue to grow taller and cover more of the planet's surface. In other words, forests are only one of the biggest carbon stores on the planet. They're also one of the biggest carbon emitters. This makes the Amazon's shift from being a carbon sink to a carbon source a really big deal, especially since it comes at the same time as the rest of the tropical forests around the world are also acting as a carbon source. In fact, a 2022 study found that in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, tropical forests around the world emitted more carbon than they took in. But we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that the Amazon rainforest is somehow unique in this regard. The issue is actually much bigger than the Amazon. A 2023 paper found that the cumulative emissions from all the forests in the tropics during the same period were equivalent to nearly 8% of global anthropogenic emissions. The thing is, however, that while forests are starting to release more carbon, it doesn't necessarily mean that the amount of carbon stored in them is actually decreasing. After all, forests are also growing. They're becoming taller and thicker and covering more ground than before. So more carbon is being stored in them overall, just not enough to compensate for the extra carbon they're releasing. And in some regions, like the Amazon, that extra carbon waste starts to trap more heat near Earth's surface. It may sound counterintuitive given that we tend to think of deforestation as a good thing, because it means more sunlight reaches the ground and so the land would cool down. But it's not quite how it works. See, even though forests block some sunlight, the air within them tends to absorb and re-emit a lot of the infrared radiation that comes from Earth's surface. As a result, forests actually tend to keep the ground beneath them warmer than if there was no forest there at all. As a result, some research suggests that as forests get thicker, the land beneath them gets up to 10 degrees Celsius warmer, and a hotter environment can lead to drier conditions, which can make it easier for fires to spread. And so that means that even without more frequent droughts, the Amazon could become more prone to wildfires as it continues to warm. Now, if you followed the science news recently, you might be thinking, wait a second, didn't we hear about a similar situation in the oceans? Turns out that what's happening in the Amazon is entirely dissimilar to what's happening in the ocean. also breathes carbon dioxide in during the day when phytoplankton use it for photosynthesis and releases it back out at night. Similarly, the ocean also takes up heat during the day when phytoplankton use the sun's energy to grow and releases that heat back out at night. In the past, the ocean's